Hello, everybody, and welcome to Philosophy Friday. I think this will be the last time we call this episode Philosophy Friday. From here on out, we're going to call it Product Philosophy, right, Brett?
That's right, man. Then we can be honest about the fact that it's not Friday today.
It is not. But in today's discussion, we're going to talk about some of the key trends or, say, lessons learned from 2021. And four specific topics that we're going to cover is first, the rise of personal brands. Second, the power of people and building relationships. Third is what I'm calling the dual nature of human society and existence. And the fourth is people just being hungry for the what we're calling the new thing. So this is our retro for 2021. And I don't know. Is that it, Brett? Are we going to talk about anything else?
I think we'll manage to talk about a lot of things in that framework.
All right. All right. So maybe just going ahead and jumping right in. I think one of the key things I did notice in 2021 is the maybe it's more not the rise of personal brands because that's been happening for a while, but I think more the popularization or people realizing the importance of personal brands and more people trying to build their personal brands. And I think that, I've kind of spoken about this before. And for some folks, just to kind of explain what I mean by personal brands, I thought I could kind of explain the way that I view it first, and then it'd be great to get your take, Brett. But what I mean by that is that I think for a long time that the power of brand in a work environment has really existed at the company level or at the product level. And so one of the big changes I think with social media has been that social media more generally, and I know it's been around for a while, but I think that the way in which people are viewing social media and the way that social media has proliferated, one of the impacts of this is that it's enabling the transparency and visibility of people in a work context to have greater exposure. And so, what I mean by that is like if we were to look at a different industry, let's say entertainment, let's say the film and television industry, what we see is that brand has actually penetrated through the company level, the product level. It has reached the creator or the worker level, the employee level. So, for example, when we talk about a movie, it's not just about the movie itself or the studio that created the movie. It's about who's the actor, who's the director, who's the writer. And people are trying to find a relationship, not just to the product and the company that they love, but to the person and the creator that they have an association or a love for. And so one of the big theories I had from years back is that this phenomenon that we saw in film would penetrate to the corporate world, and so more of the typical enterprise and working world. And I think that this is starting to occur at a much more accelerated pace in 2021. And just speaking from a personal basis, I can tell you that it's a very powerful effect that even for me personally, as I have tried to build a personal brand, have tried to build content and basically get more visibility around what we're working at Lila Games and kind of what we're trying to do, the kind of product we're trying to build and things of that nature. That has I can definitively say that if I didn't do that, we may not have gotten our funding, and that has helped us raise our rounds of funding that we have had for as an example. And so it feels like this has been the year that more people have become aware of the power of personal brand, and that I think that we're going to see that trend accelerate in 2022. But I don't know, Brett, and I know you also have been getting a little bit more active, both in terms of what we're doing here with Philosophy Friday / Product Philosophy, but also kind of in some of your LinkedIn posts and things like that. But what do you think?
I couldn't agree more, and I definitely want to give you a shout out for being somebody who said this a long time ago that this was going to happen, and it now being here, and that The personal brand identity, strength, and all that's been happening for a few years now is something I definitely resisted for a long time. And I think it was personally hard for me to balance between being what I would call an artist, which is more of that internal worker, the sort of the quiet, the deep thought work that we've talked about before in other podcasts, and the manager, I would say more of, which is more of that person who's going to connect with other people, who's going to do more BD, who's going to have more meetings and things like that. Like I just have had a tough time doing both. But I think at this point, to your point, that it's become so powerful and so important that it's almost impossible, or not impossible, but it's detrimental for me not to start developing my skills more on the personal brand and side of things, because I think what we're seeing is that it's becoming so strong that it can overcome and overpower good products, right? So if you're a company or you're a game or you're a politician or a leader or whatever you may be, if you're going to just hang your hat on, hey, I do good work, at this point I think that's not enough, right? And I know this is a controversial thing to bring up, but I think we should learn from all things. I think probably the strongest example of this is Trump, right? I mean, Trump,
Yeah.
we can learn from some of the things he did. He did become president of the United States. And we saw the power of the individual brand and the ability to leverage some of these tools like Twitter and other tools to influence a lot of people. And whether or not you believe in his policies obviously is up to you to choose. And I'm not trying to talk about politics here, but I mean, again, if you look at what he was able to accomplish with those tools, you have to sort of say like, wow, look at how powerful these mediums have become if you use them in certain ways. And again, we're not going to get into the specifics, but we're also seeing this happen in gaming. In our recap report, we're writing about how Candy Crush Saga used Khloe Kardashian to promote one of their recent big feature releases around tournaments. And that was very impactful, partly because they integrated Khloe Kardashian very well in the feature in multiple different instances. And this was Khloe Kardashian, right? This wasn't someone who had a lot of talents or skills, right? And we
Right.
did see it as well in Brawl Stars with Mr. Beast, right? And arguably Mr. Beast and Chloe have skills. I'm not trying to say they're not. Certainly Mr. Beast does put some great content out there, but they're not the sort of typical star that you would think of promoting things. And Brawl Stars saw some very strong download uptick because of Mr. Beast, because of that. So I definitely think that this is to the point where it's unavoidable. And I think in some ways it's a good thing, because I think we're, as a society, trying to focus on products and brands that we not only like the product, but we also like the person that's creating it. And then in other ways, it can be kind of dangerous if the personal branding can overshadow the actual product or the actual like skills of the person, right? And again, we mentioned Trump, and I'm sure that that's a lot of people could argue that happened, right? So it's a double-edged sword, but one that you can't avoid at this point, right?
Yeah. And I do think, to your point about Trump, one of the things that we found out is that Trump's personal brand, and again, I actually, I'm comfortable saying that I don't like Trump, but to your point, I will say he was one of the early innovators who understood the power of social media, of personal brand. And to some degree, he kind of showed that his personal brand, you know, to some degree was more powerful than the Republican Party itself, right? So there was that power dynamic between the power of his brand and the loyalty that people had to him personally relative to what could you do as an established institution like the Republican Party. And I think we've seen that example in other cases as well, where, let's say, very recently we saw attacks on Elon Musk, for example, by members of the Democratic Party, whether it was Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders or whoever. And I think what it became clear is that Elon Musk is more powerful than the Democratic Party, right? Like his brand is more, and I hope that the Democrats take note of this. Like, just like it's powerful, but it's not like everybody does not know that. I think that AOC was one also early in leveraging social media for her brand, and again, whether you agree with her politics or not, she was very successful in leveraging social media to have success. And as another example, Joe Rogan, when CNN came after him for ivermectin, and whether you agree with the use of ivermectin or not, the way that they characterized his use of ivermectin was not correct. And what CNN found out is that Joe Rogan's platform is actually, and his personal brand is more powerful than CNN, like a very powerful established institution. And so it's a whole new world, I think. 2021 showed us that the power of individual people and brands can be more powerful than these big established institutions. And this trend, in my opinion, is going to continue to accelerate.
Yeah, and I think to your point, you about the Democratic Party. I mean, I think it would be dangerous not to stop and reflect on some of the things that Trump did well, right? And I will agree with you. I mean, I would go out and say that I obviously don't support Trump, but to go and not look at and say, okay, well, what are the things that we can learn from Trump and take from
Yeah,
Trump that he did well is going to be a huge mistake for the Democratic Party
right.
and anyone else, right? And I'll just list a couple of them. I mean, the first is that he tapped into people's emotions, right? He did not stand up on platforms and use a bunch of very long-winded sentences and paragraphs that supported logical reasons for doing things, which has its place, obviously. He tapped into people's emotions, right? And that's something that or any good marketer will tell you, but that we all need to remember. And we've talked about this in our podcast, how I've been really focusing in on my emotional creative brain and understanding that that is the more powerful side of your brain to influence and connect with other people. And I've personally have not developed it as much, thinking it's sort of like the child brain, but it's not. It's very powerful side of your brain that if you can use it is incredibly valuable. The second thing is that he spoke in very clear language, right? eh, he spoke in language that everyone can understand, as opposed to some of the politicians who speak in language that honestly I have a degree from high ranking university and I couldn't understand it, right? So he did that, which was well. And then the third is he leveraged these technologies, right? And so as we're talking about building individual brand, I think one of the things I've learned from Trump, and I learned from you prior to that probably, is that being open and vulnerable on social media is okay. Like people are actually much more forgiving, right? Like when I first started posting stuff, it had to be edited and perfect and all this stuff. And what I found was sometimes when I would just walk in the park and video myself thinking my thoughts of what was the next trend or what this report was about, that would get so much more shares and so much more follows or clicks and all this stuff, which doesn't necessarily mean that it's better, but it certainly got a lot more response because it was approachable, it was relatable, it was honest, it was authentic, and it wasn't so scripted. And I think that's something that as we start all exploring this like individual personal brand building exercise, I think those are things that we want to remember.
And maybe I could also just kind of add on a couple of potential implications of the rise of the personal brand. First of which is this other concept that I've talked about before, which I just called the digital footprint, meaning that for anyone, for you as an individual with a work history, with specific skills and talents and things like that, the more you have online, whatever it is, whether it's a GitHub, repo of some kind that kind of shows what you're capable of doing, whether it's a podcast, whether it's a website that details a project that you've worked on, the more that you have online, that not only expands your personal brand, but also serves as this digital footprint that talks about who you are, what you're capable of. That makes it, in my opinion, a lot easier. Where what I guess what I'm saying is that the future of the resume as a piece of paper with a bunch of crap on it is I wouldn't say over, but meaningfully less impactful than your what I'm calling digital footprint, your personal brand, the stuff you've worked on, and your ability to show your capabilities to a future employer. What you have online is going to be, in my opinion, a lot more valuable than this piece of paper that said, I worked at Google from 2017 to 2020. I did this. I went to Berkeley or Stanford or wherever. Like that stuff is fine, but increasingly it's going to be more about your digital footprint that in practicality shows more depth around who you are specifically and what you're capable of. And and probably just the second point I want to make is that I also think that it's interesting about the rise of the personal brand. I think that it also speaks to what I'm calling the rise of individualism. Actually, this is a point I watched an interview with Peter Thiel. I watch a lot of Peter Thiel actually because I think he's a smart guy.
I know.
But he talked about this. He talked about how there's no more like ticker tape parades for anyone, and he equated that to like the loss of like individualism, of celebrating heroes and people for accomplishments. And I think that when we think about society as a whole, like it does seem like, and we're going to talk about the duality of human nature and existence later, but like this battle between, do we uphold people for being exceptional, or do we try and make everyone equal, right? Like, and I think that the power of the personal brand and just the popularity of it speaks to the fact that we may be shifting from a time in the past where New York used to have ticker tape parades and used to celebrate individual achievements, to a time now where it's more about, hey, let's have equity and let's kind of distribute everything equally. Let's kind of take down our heroes, like whether it's Elon Musk or whoever. And I think we are going to be shifting more towards individualism again in the near future.
Interesting. I don't know if I agree with that, but I think there's been a meritocracy around it. And I don't know, for example, I'm a hunter, and there's a guy in hunting, Cam, I can't remember his last name right now. That's Cam, shoot. Anyways, he's just a regular like guy who basically is in awesome shape. He does he goes elk hunting and these super extreme elk hunts with a bow, and he posts videos, and he's been doing it for a long time. And now he's friends with Joe Rogan and Tom Brady and has millions of followers and all these other things. And it's like, this guy is like a marketing manager at a random company in, like, I don't even know, Colorado or something, like, or Portland. He's in Portland. I mean, it's pretty impressive. Like, he's just basically become a Joe Rogan level person because he's super
in a specific
intense.
area, right?
No, this guy is like national level, dude. Like, this guy is no joke. Like, if I can't believe I can't remember his name right now, but my Instagram feed, there's probably like 5 videos of it right now. But who is it? I'm sure it's gonna be like the first one. Anyways, this is, I mean, but the interesting, Cam Haynes, thank you. And the interesting thing is that it's kind of interesting because it makes it feel a little bit more attainable for anybody to become these people, right? Like Joe Rogan was, I mean, what was he? He was a sort of a comedian, and then he was on Fear Factor, and now he's like the top podcaster, right? So you don't have to be Brad Pitt looking to become this person, right? Joe Rogan would be the first to admit he's not Brad Pitt looking, right? Or he's not Brad Pitt talent, or he's a hardworking guy who is not afraid to call people out. So I think that's I think that's really interesting. I mean, there's a lot of instances of it. So to your earlier point, though, the one thing I will say that you're still alluding to being a creator, right? Because your footprint really has to be things that you've created. And I 100% agree that the resume. I mean, we don't look at resumes at Liquid and Grit, so I mean, we're already there.
Mhm.
We require no previous experience, and we require no resume or LinkedIn profile or anything. But I think there's a difference between being a commenter on LinkedIn and being able and creating content, right?
Yeah.
And I think that if you are thinking about your footprint, I'd err on the side of creating and building things, even if you don't fall through. At least you're like, oh, I tried this and I tried that, I tried that. But um, those have always led me to good places.
Yeah, and I do think that one of the things to think about for our audience moving into 2022 is if you believe in this trend and if you believe in the power of building a personal brand, it's going to soon become a pretty crowded space for whatever industry that you're in. And so I think there is one of the things that I remember from Roger McNamee, who's like a famous hedge fund guy, a famous investor, is this quote where he said that between the content and the audience, everything in between is a choice. And one of the things that he really talked about is that if you're the only source of a specific type of content, people will, I mean, over time, kind of find you, right? Regardless of the distribution platform, whether you're on Twitter or Medium or wherever, YouTube or wherever. But I think that to that point, you just really need to have an original voice. And I think there's a time for synthesizers, and I think there is a place for what Naval Ravikant calls like fortune cookies, people that and we've all seen this, whether it's on LinkedIn or Twitter, where someone just says some random bullshit, like some Confucian wisdom of some kind. It's just like, okay, whatever, right? So there's like being a synthesizer. There's like the random fortune cookie stuff, and then there's like original thought where from first principles, from your experience against a specific problem, you provide something that is truly insightful. And I think that that's what people will be attracted to is over time, if you can show and if you can exhibit the ability to have insight and to articulate those insights in a clear way, that will be what helps you build your personal brand over time. And other people, whether it's the fortune cookie guys or the synthesizers, might win in the short term, but in the long term, I do think that the people who have those original thoughts and are consistent over time will win.
Yeah, and the last thing I said was total crap, so we'll have to cut that out. But the one what I was gonna what the interesting thing about today too is that businesses are letting you be individuals, right? Like
Yeah,
we see instances in gaming where we have Adam, for example, who's at Warner Brothers, that is a pretty litigious company, allowing him to be on a podcast,
yeah,
right? Which is pretty unique to this era. I mean, before you were either an individual or you were part of a business. And if you're part of a business, you couldn't be an individual, right? And we're seeing that change where people at Rovio and Warner Brothers and other companies can post stuff and they're totally okay with it. And to your point of being an individual, this goes pretty deep, but we are philosophers here. I think one of the things that to do that I've found is the further and further you really understand who you are as a person, and the more and more you're authentic and genuine about that, the easier it is for you to carve out your own little niche, right? Like I happen to be into hunting. It is weird. Like my dad was a computer consultant. I happen to be really into fishing and the outdoors. I don't know why. I honestly like sometimes I'll be leaving the fishing and I'll be like, why did you just do that? Why didn't you just sit on the couch like every other dad and watch football? I don't know, or like why are you playing games and why are you doing this? But the more that I know that about myself, the more unique I am, right? Like I'm not I'm competing with the only other people who like to read, uh, like to build businesses, and like games, right? Like, how many people out there are like that have those combinations? Not that many, right? So I've sort of like found, like, to your point, but I only kind of found that with being authentic with myself and being like, well, I'm kind of into these random things. And then once I meshed them together, it was like, okay, this is my little niche. And I think where people get into trouble is they kind of, through society, they kind of convince themselves like, oh, I'm into the newest hottest thing, right? The newest platform's coming out, that's what I'm into. And it's like, really, dude, are you really into fintech? Like, is fintech really your thing? Like, were you a
Yeah.
kid, like, telling your daddy, like, what do you want to do when you grow up? It's like, I want to be in fintech. It's like, no, you weren't. You were probably playing Super Mario, right? Like I was. So I think that's, and then you try to write about fintech, and it, like, after 9 months, you're writing about this thing you're not interested in. And anyways, so it just goes back to knowing who you are is an incredibly powerful thing, I think, that I've learned this
Yeah.
year. So back to the original point.
Or maybe we could transition to our second topic slash lesson learned, which is, for me, the power of people and building relationships. And I would say, like, I mean, I've always kind of conceptually known that people are important, building relationships is important. I would say that one of the biggest lessons I did learn working at NBC Universal, and just talking about LA and the difference between LA and Silicon Valley, is that I would say that a lot of people in Silicon Valley are more transactional, meaning, hey, I'm good. Everything's viewed as a specific transaction, whereas people in LA are thinking more about relationships and building long-term relationships. Now, the downside of that is that when you build those relationships, it's like, then it becomes less about performance and more about, helping each other out in, like, I would say, if you have a relationship but it's done in the right way where it's ethical, then I think that's fine. But I think there's a darker side to that as well. But I would say that I think that one of the best things that I've done in 2021 is to try and work on this, to build deeper, more meaningful relationships with people. And I started thinking about this because Ray Dalio has talked about this a lot, where he talked about, like, one of the purposes of his life is to do meaningful work and cultivate meaningful relationships. And so when you think about, your life and value in your life, or doing important things in your life, or how you want to spend your time, I think that that's a really great way of characterizing it, right? Simple. You want to do meaningful work, you want to have meaningful relationships. And so that second part, the relationship part, is something that I try to actively work on. And I would say that, Brett, you and I are on a certain kind of private Slack together, which I'm incredibly grateful for. I've also tried to build a couple of, like, I would call it secret private tribes, meaning people who are interested or who are related by a specific characteristics, and then we'll have meetings together. And I have found those to be so valuable, and in which I think they have served as ways of building relationships with really great people. But also the help that I've gotten from those networks has been incredible. So I think we've talked about the notion of tribes before, but I do think for some of you who don't have like a tribe, or a way in which you can have a platform for a community of some kind, I would highly recommend thinking about that, at least for 2022. Brad, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think this is it's an interesting theme. I think I mean, we've talked about, there's a balance, right?
Yeah.
I think certainly strong relationships. I think in my personal life, actually, is something that I would take as a theme for me more so. And I think in my business life as well. I think I've viewed business a little bit too transactional in some ways. I think I've been scared in a way to create relationships with people. For whatever reason, I always generally don't think people care about me that much. So So this is some of the things in my past, for whatever reason, but but now that I've worked in the gaming industry for over a decade now, it's like, like we've worked together for a lot of years, right?
Mhm.
And it's sort of like, well, I could go through life like just being transactional with JK, or I mean, we were spending a lot of time together, more so than I'm probably spending time with a lot of other people in my life. Like, why wouldn't I just form a relationship with JK and talk about what's going on in his life, outside of figuring out how I can leverage our relationship or anything like that. And I think that's a really wonderful thing to develop in business. And obviously you have to be careful that it doesn't cloud your judgment, right? And unfortunately, business, as I've learned, it can be a very uh, it, a very objective thing, right? Like you have to make these objective decisions as a CEO and as a leader, and so you have to balance that, or those relationships that you built with, like that, those objective decisions that you make. But if you can, it can be very powerful. I called several people on Christmas Day that work with me, right? Work at my company. So, eh, and I'll say on a personal note, I think that a couple years ago, I was actually watching a documentary on the Restrepo. I don't know if you've seen it, but
Mhm.
on a personal level, I was watching this documentary, and these guys are in the Korengal Valley. It's this very intense documentary. But the thing that I watched it and I came away with was these guys were in what most of us would consider hell, right? They're getting shot at every day. And they come back to the States, and they had bonds that were so strong over there that several of them said they wanted to go back because they wanted to have that that camaraderie that they had over there. And one quote that really struck me was, one guy said, "That was my those guys are my family. My family is not my family." And what struck me was I was sitting in my, a house in California, whatever, and I felt like, wow, I'm like striving to have a huge fancy house someday with no friends, with no connections. And when I look back on my life, I realized the happiest times of my life, I had very little money, and I was surrounded with my closest friends, and none of us had any money. And those are the happiest moments of my life, right? So
Right.
here I am striving to be a rich guy in a giant house by myself. And here I'm watching the video of these guys who want to live in hell again because they want those bonds.
Right.
Am I going about this the right way? Am I going about life the right way? And it was a really transformative moment for me. And it made me realize, like, wow, like what are these things? And I do think you want meaningful work, but what is this? What is the purpose of this if you don't have these relationships that make that create so much value in your life when you even had nothing, right? And so
Yeah.
on a personal level, and I think for us dads out there who are like busy with work, and we kind of put those emotions on like a second tier of importance in relationships as well. I- I've I've since put the emphasis on that, and it's been incredibly rewarding. And I highly recommend doing the same if you're not right now, because it can be very rewarding in work and in personal life. So
Yeah, I think for me, one of the objectives I've had for 2021 is to try and think about relationships like I think about time. And we've been on the podcast before talking about how important time is. Don't waste time. Make sure you use your time in the best way possible. But I think that it would help a lot of folks to also think in similar terms in terms of their relationships. Now, there's a pretty famous quote or concept that speaks about how you are oftentimes the average of the top 5 people that you spend time with, right? And so when you think about the relationships you do develop, I I would just caution people. I don't know, maybe it's the word caution is a little too strong, but just like think about, with life is short, with a limited amount of time you have, the relationships that you invest in. And I do think that all of us should think about this concept of investing in relationships, but just be careful about it as well. Like if there's a relationship that just doesn't make sense, I would say get rid of it. So, but yeah,
Totally.
and again, if you haven't read Ray Dalio, I'll drop a link where he talks about his own philosophy in terms of meaningful work and what he means by meaningful relationships. But again, I definitely would recommend that you at least think about it. At least for me personally, it's been one of the best uses of my time in 2021 is developing those relationships and building specific platforms to be able to have better relationships with people I think are interesting and that you normally would not have the ability to speak to on a normal basis. Okay, should we tackle something super deep, Brett?
Yeah, I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this. So,
All right, so this is a trend or kind of observation that I wanted to highlight, which I'm calling, and since we're philosophers here, but I'm calling it the dual nature of human society and existence. Okay. And what I mean by this is that, so I read this book called The Fourth Turning earlier this year. And it's actually quite a fascinating book. If you haven't read it, I would recommend that you do check it out. But it also talks, one of the main themes it talks about is like this duality between life and society operating in cycles versus linear improvement. And it got me thinking about a lot of duality that exists in life, in work, in society, in the universe, right? And it was further kind of enforced when I read and reviewed some of the writings of Ray Dalio as he speaks about cycles and how there's generally like opposing perspectives, a duality that causes the cycle, whether that's rich versus poor, left versus right. The duality between different systems is oftentimes what causes the destruction of a system or world order and the creation of something new. And that just got me to think about a lot of the duality that does exist in life, society, nature, the world, things like that. And so, I mean, obviously, we're in a world in terms of politics where there's like a big battle right now. It's very, popular, top of mind when we think about, ultra liberalism versus ultra conservatism. But there's also things like, life. There is a perspective of life being very random and in which, anything can happen versus determinism, where, things, you can determine the outcome of your life, for example. We talked about cycles versus linear progression. I've spoken on the podcast before about holism versus reductionism a little bit. Rich versus poor, command and control, like China versus decentralization or democracy. In technologies, there's client versus server. In physics, there's is the smallest are are we composed of particles or is it a wave? I mean, there's even that debate. And so, like, this duality, in my opinion, exists in life. And for me, I feel like it's been kind of observing this duality that seems to exist in more places than I had really thought about. I think it helps understanding what those opposing perspectives are and just trying to understand those perspectives for me has been something that's been like an interesting observation. And Brett, I know that when I talked about randomness and millennials during the last podcast, that's kind of what I meant is that, so when you think about it, if you have, as an example of this duality, if you have a generation of people that kind of think, well, whatever I do, I could be killed tomorrow. I don't have that much control over my life. And then that leads to a certain outlook. It leads to a certain perspective on life, which I think helps explain some of the key trends in society. And I do also think that these things tend to come in waves or cycles. And so, like, maybe generation or maybe the millennials could have this more random outlook on life. But Generation Z the upcoming generation will then shift back to determinism. And so, what impact will that have, for example? And so, anyway, that's basically one of the things I just wanted to talk about is that I have been observing this kind of duality that exists a lot more in 2021 than I have ever in my life. And as I think about that, when I come upon different kinds of situations, I try to think about what is that duality? What are the opposing perspectives here? And then trying to think about trends, society in that kind of context of this one opposing perspective versus the other. Did I go
Interesting.
too crazy on you, Brett? What do you think?
No, the wilder the better, man, for sure. I mean, I think I was trying to understand it while you were talking, and I think at least what came to my mind was that many things in life are very complex, and they aren't as clear as we like to imagine them. And I think that's something that I've certainly brought or learned in this year that I think you're touching on, right? It's like we want to be definitive in our thought and our arguments and our political positions and the way we live our life and the way we run our companies and all these different things, right? If that's sort of our human nature. But if you take this view that you're taking, which I really like, is you start to like get zoom out and you start seeing like, okay, look at all these trends that have happened over the last 100, 500 years and how they've swung from one way to the other. Maybe my thought isn't so 100% sure. Like maybe this is just a reflection of what was before, what was after, and what was before that, and maybe this has something to do with this group think, and maybe it's just a little bit different from what the other person is saying, and maybe I should kind of understand that they might be on a different wave. And I think that that's really what I've learned this year, or maybe I had it before, but what a big theme of it is, and I hope that we all sort of embrace, is like there are dualities to it, but it's complex, right? And we're struggling between these dualities and and trying to progress. And I think in general we all want to progress, and we're not really in agreement on how generally. Sometimes sometimes we are, but obviously as you think about like everybody, we have their differences of opinions. um and it's not like black or white, even though we want it to be, right? Like the way that I run my company isn't potentially the right way for everybody. Even though
Sure.
sometimes this year I was like, yeah, it's the right way, JK, you have to run it this way. It's like
Yeah.
after that was one of the things that I came to after we talked about stuff. It's like, okay, well, maybe it doesn't work well for that. Maybe it doesn't work well for the manager. Maybe it doesn't work well for this, and having an open mind and kind of taking your stance on it, or understanding your stance on it, made me like, okay, it's maybe a little more complex about stuff. So, um, it, I do think it's a great theme, and I think it's one I hope we all take into the next year. Because I think we'll be
Right.
all a little bit more understanding of everybody if we do.
Yeah. Great point. And yeah, I don't know if there's any specific takeaway for our audience from that, but I would just say maybe for our audience to also just try and observe this kind of phenomenon in terms of duality. And to your point, Brett, I think one of the key things that was talked about by Ray Dalio is that these things just come in waves, and it kind of shifts between, goes back and forth. I mean, even in technology, client versus server, that thing's just gone back and forth like multiple times,
Yeah.
right?
I think
So,
the takeaway, if there is a takeaway, and this is something that I've talked about a little bit, it's to have a plan and build a system that responds well to the unexpected. Like that is what I generally try to live by in my personal life and in my business.
right.
Have a plan for what you think is going to happen, because if you can predict the future and you are right, you can be rewarded greatly, right? If you can predict the crash or the boom or whatever, you can be right, right? But life is unpredictable. So also have a system or a way that you live your life, or a way that you're prepared for something completely unexpected. You actually can't prepare for it in the way that you actually know it's going to happen, meaning you have no way of knowing that COVID is going to happen, right? Or you have no way of knowing the next thing that's going to happen. How do you make yourself prepare for that? resiliency, you're in good shape, you're mentally prepared, you have strong faith, whatever it is, right? You figure it out. I'm not, it's different for all of us,
Right.
but those are what I think are really, in terms of a business, in terms of a gaming company, in terms of an individual, try to predict and capitalize on the future that you think is going to happen, but also be prepared for a future that you never expected. Like those are the two ways I think.
Yeah, and I think just Bill Walsh and the score takes care of itself. He was actually pretty big on contingency planning and having a plan B just in case things went wrong. And like situational sort of analysis, like what happens when we're in, third and long, or when we're in, like different kinds of potential scenarios. He was pretty big on making sure that you had some kind of a plan. So, all right, last key trend or lesson. Do you want to go over this one, Brett?
Yeah, I think the last trend that we're seeing, probably the second half of the year, but we do see some of it earlier, is just the hunger that we all seem to have for the new thing, right? And that is a reference to a book that I've read a while ago, so I'm not super up to date in all the details of it. But the new thing, right, being like the next platform, the next big market, the next whatever. And I think one of the things that we were both referencing as sort of an example of that was Clubhouse. That was earlier in the year, but it was wow. We were all so convinced that Clubhouse was going to be massive, right? And we're jumping on. I must admit, I was a little bit more hesitant to other people, but I was on Clubhouse and it was sort of like, okay, this is going to be huge, right? Let's get on Clubhouse. This is going to be the next. And I don't think we ever all thought it was going to be the next Facebook, but there was just a desire there. There was sort of a blind desire in that we overlooked one of the sort of obvious issues with it was that you had to be online at a certain time. It couldn't be asynchronous, which is a huge pain. And we're now seeing this with the metaverse, right? I mean, everybody is quick to jump on the metaverse. VR, I think, could probably be another good example of that. Maybe, obviously, not this year. It's been around for a while, but maybe a little too eager to jump on VR. NFTs and the blockchain, I do think that NFTs are going to impact gaming, but I'm a little bit leery of how quickly it is. And we are already seeing a ton of companies jump on this bandwagon and go, yeah, we've built this division and I don't know how much they're investing in it. Maybe it's just one person who's sitting there reading NFT research or whatever, which is fine. But if they're going to go out and build a whole game and build a whole team, like that's a pretty serious investment. And maybe NFTs is the next big thing, right? Maybe it's the size of the mobile gaming industry, but that's much less likely, obviously, than it being what I think it's going to be, which is like the real money gaming market in the US, for example, right? Like the male audience, 25 to 35-year-old spender who's very focused on utility, right? Only wants to play poker because he can win money, or only wants to do something because he's going to get something out of it. And if it's that size market, well, there's probably only going to be a couple like really big winners, right? So I think that there's just kind of this like desire for the new thing. And on a personal level, I think that for the listeners who are, I'm assuming, product managers and gaming companies or whatever, I would be careful to jump on the next trend. Like I saw a lot of my coworkers and peers at Zynga do that, where they jump on the next thing. Like this is going to be the next big thing. I remember pot was going to be a huge thing, and I had a couple. We lost a PM in our gaming company to pot, right? Like pot was going to be just like the biggest market, and maybe it still will be, but it certainly didn't happen overnight. And I think I think it's some people do get lucky with that stuff, but I think it's a dangerous game to play. Like stick to things you're interested in that you find interesting and you can like do for 3, 5 years, because that's where you can really create a lot of value, right? Like you can stick in it. JK and I, we've stuck in games for a long time. We both loved games. Like these industries that aren't going away, games have been around for thousands and thousands of years, that you are actually interested in, like that's much more valuable than jumping off into the NFT space. If you don't have any interest in the NFT, or if you have no interest in being virtual, like don't jump in the metaverse space, right? Like like just be honest with who you are and don't jump on the newest trend, or maybe like adopt some of the aspects of it, but be careful of it, right? And I think in the gaming industry too, it's like it's okay to be second mover. Like there's a lot of research that second mover is more valuable than first mover. Like it's if the NFT market is the size of the mobile gaming market, there'll be plenty of money for you to make, and it might be prudent for you to just like sit it out for a couple of years and just like let other people kind of thrash and figure it out, and then you come in with your brand or your whatever. So yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you, Brett. I think that it seems like increasingly there is this I guess we're calling it hunger, but like this strong desire for quick growth and just I guess what I'm calling GRQ, get rich quick. It's like how do I get rich really fast, right? And I think people should really focus more on what they're strong at and where they can actually add real meaningful value instead of the next big shiny thing which may not materialize. And I think metaverse is a great example. Nobody understands what the fuck it is. Like no one has a really good understanding of what it is, and yet people are like trying to go all in on it. Right? And not to say that like if you have a good perspective and if you have something to share or if you have a product to make, I think that's fine. But it seems like more people are just opining on vague nonsense rather than having a specific perspective or something tangible to add to the metaverse as an example. And so I do hope people do understand that building value is I think really more about understanding what you're good at and doing something over a long period of time. And if I remember correctly, there are some statistics, and I think I also probably heard this from Peter Thiel, that the majority of value in startups actually comes after year 10, right? Like 80% of the value is after year 10 for most startups. And you can see that in like PayPal and other companies, right? Tesla, other companies like that. And so instead of going for that big new shiny thing, or if something is hard but you're good at it, like stick it through. Don't just pivot over because you had opportunities to just do some crypto or blockchain based thing. And actually something similar happened to us. Like, we were out fundraising and it's just like, hey, if you guys go all in on, crypto, we'll offer you this much money. And it's like, oh, but it's
Yeah.
like, no, no, no. But then ultimately we thought about it like, that's not really us. It's not us. And so I think, at that time, while tempting, I think we made the right decision. And again, that's not to say that, crypto is not going to work. I have my own doubts about it, at least in the short to medium term. But I guess to your point, I feel like society today, and this goes back to the duality of human nature, but there's like this, there's a certain philosophy around, investing and building for a longer term future, and then versus get rich quick. And I think the pendulum has been swinging more and more towards how do we make money fast? How do I, and this is why crypto has gotten so popular, is just because people see the quick increases and gains in cryptocurrencies and things like that. And they also just want to like, just figure out how do you make a lot of money fast. And instead I would hope that people think more about longer term value and mission. And going back to Ray Dalio, if you can erase it all and just think about meaningful work, meaningful relationships, I mean, those concepts, I think that concept is a fundamental truth. And so grounding yourself in fundamental truth versus get rich quick, I hope people think about more in 2022.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I've seen people get rich quick. And
Yeah.
you know the funny thing about it is they go back to work and they basically do the same thing that they were doing before they got rich quick. And they just have to start over again. So to your point, what's the purpose of getting rich quick? You have a lot of money, which I mean, there's value in having a lot of money, but then most of the people I've seen who end up having a lot of money realize that the thing that they really want to do is to create meaningful things and have strong relationships, right?
Yeah.
And unfortunately, some of them gave up their strong relationships to get quick, but rich quick. But the important thing is that creating something of value is more valuable than all the money, right? So you want to be careful about just getting rich quick, because it's like you lose so much of what is valuable in life. And I was reading Henry Ford, a book on Henry Ford, and he had a quote where he said he actually failed to make the first car company, and he was sort of like, well, yeah, I mean, what's the rush? This is my life work. This is my life's work, right? Like, I'm going to just get after it again. And that struck me because it it's like, yeah, this is my life's work. Like, this is what I'm leaving on this earth. And sometimes I think about my own company that way. I have a very long term view on it, and people are often very surprised when I'm like, yeah, I don't really care if I do this for the next 20, 30 years. Like, what? 20, 30 years? It's like, listen, buddy, I will be 60, 65. Like, that's not that old. Like, I don't really, let's say I don't even know if I will want to retire at that age if I had the option, right? So that's 25 years from now. So yeah, like, well, that's okay for me, right? Like, why are you trying to retire at 45? What are you going to do? And I think that that goes for your career as well. Like you said, like, just because it's going to be a shiny new object and you're going to jump on board, and it's going to take you 10 years. We're 6 years into Liquid and Grit, and if you look at the history of Facebook, like one of the fastest growing companies, yeah, it took a long time before that was like massive, right? So that's the best of the best. So you better be interested in it, because you're going to have to do this for 10 years. And I would say that's always been an advantage of mine, that I am interested in it, because I'm always like, hey, dude, you want to take a day off? Well, you lost, because I won't, not because I'm like the hardest working dude in the planet, but because I'm actually interested in this. And you're convincing yourself to do it because you think you're going to get rich, right? So you're waking up every morning going, someday I'll be rich, like, just do it today, right? I'm waking up and just doing it because I intrinsically enjoy it. So it's a Sunday, and I've worked, and I have the day off. I have no kids. It's the day after Christmas, and I've worked multiple hours today. Not because I'm like, yeah, I got to get work done or whatever. It's because I actually enjoy it. Like, I want to be doing these things. In fact, I'm trying to pull myself from it so that I can do these other things. So you're competing with somebody who on a Sunday, the day after Christmas, by himself, can do anything and is choosing to work, right? You better buckle up if you're doing this to get rich, because this is 6 years in and I'm doing it this way. And I'm just highlighting that there are other people out there doing the same thing, right? Like, they're not, Elon Musk isn't building a car because he just wants, he wants to get rich. Like, he really wants to, like, improve the world, right? So you better be
Yeah.
ready to battle it out with that person who's getting up for fun, getting up like you would get up for the thing that you enjoy. That's a very hard person to beat out, even if you're smarter, have millions of dollars or whatever. You know what I mean? Like, after a year or 2 years, like, you're gonna start dragging your feet. Where that person's just gonna be getting up, like, yeah, I get to go do the thing I want to do. So
Yeah.
it's an incredible advantage.
Yeah, and speaking of Facebook, I know there's a lot of criticism about Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg, but there's also a pretty famous anecdote about Mark when he was given an opportunity. Well, I think Yahoo made like a, I don't know, $1 billion offer to acquire Facebook during its early days, and the board was pressuring Mark to actually accept. And then I believe Mark basically told the board, "Well, why? If I made that money, I would just start another social network and do basically what I'm doing now." So yeah, I definitely
Yeah.
think it's a good point, and that you know the thinking in terms of the long term is very difficult, and people talk about it all the time. Play the long game, think long term, but it's a fundamental truth. If you play the long game, go for the long term. I mean, you weed out a lot of competition just because not everyone's oriented around the long term, and so if you can get there, Yeah, it's like I would do just like Brett said, think about the long term, optimize for year 10. So,
Yeah. And we talked about this in other podcasts is if you think about the long term and the best case scenario,
mhm,
it becomes clear, right? Don't
yeah,
think 10 years from now you're going to be a senior product manager. You know what I mean? Like think 10 years from now you're going to be the CEO of a public gaming company, right? And when you make it extreme, it becomes clear about what you want. Maybe you don't want to be a CEO of public. I don't want to be a
yeah.
CEO of a public gaming company. Like unless I own the company outright and didn't have to deal with a public like that's not something I want, but maybe you do, right? So long term and extremes help clarify things. So that's all I got,
All right.
JK.
All
I
right,
probably have
we're
more.
right around an hour, and
Huh?
let's see. Yeah, I think that's it for us for 2021. Last podcast of philosophy, what was known as Philosophy Friday, which will now be product philosophy going into 2022. Hope you all had a great year. Please stay tuned, keep watching, and we'll catch you next time, everybody. Catch y'all later.